Greetings. Good day, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are on this fast-forward, turbulent, hopeful, freaked-out planet. This is Andy Revkin. I'm running a new initiative at Columbia University on communication and sustainability. And part of what I'm trying to figure out, with everyone's help, is how to step back from the nonstop flow of information around the pandemic, much of which may not be very useful to you, and cut through to the core of what we need to know as a community, as individuals, and as practitioners, including journalists, on how to make more impact for better. That's the goal. And today is the focus is viral origins. It's important right now, actually. It's important to dig in on the now and the how of what we're doing with exposure and vulnerability to this virus, and planning a little bit ahead toward a more resilient society everywhere. But if we're not thinking, how did it come about? What are the origins? Then we're going to be doomed to ever more cycles of this pandemic in the pandemic century, as opposed to a pandemic year or decade. That would kind of suck. So I brought in some people here today to interrogate the latest questions around the origin of the virus, including the politics of it, which has gotten pretty heated, sadly. You would think we could figure out how to be grown-ups, but somehow that doesn't seem to be in everybody's foreground. Our main guest today is Peter Daszak, who is the founder and scientist behind EcoHealth Alliance, which has been kind of at the heart of this question of where viruses come from and how do they become pandemic. If they were just an isolated thing in bats, then we wouldn't have to think so much about this. Unfortunately, that's not how things work. So Peter, it's great to have you here today. And along with Peter is Angela Rasmussen, who's a virologist at Columbia here. Well, I'm not at Columbia, we're all scattered, whose focus is on basically extreme viral events. You know, how do these viruses wreak their physiological havoc once they get into us? Where do they go? And Angie has been a brave soul diving into social media, like so many epidemiologists and biologists, pathologists, and ER doctors who've kind of come into this media soup to help clarify things. Angie _ Rasmussen, and two journalists who are so much more dug in on this than I am. I've focused right now on building my initiative. I do a lot of blogging, but I haven't been doing a lot of original reporting. So if I didn't have people like Jon Cohen and Eliza Barclay to rely on for more insights, I'd be in trouble. And I hope you rely on them too. Jon is at Science Magazine. He's been covering epidemic risk for decades, going back to the AIDS era. And Eliza Barclay is the climate, health, and science editor at Vox.com, which is a great enterprise. One of my favorite longtime climate people, David Roberts, is at Vox too. Do great work there. So greetings to you all. I'm going to show our faces more now so we can have a bit of a discussion. But we'll start with Peter, who's been through a swirl. You're not only in the middle of the epidemic origins biological question, but you've been at the middle of the infodemic as well. The infodemic being this storm of much of it manufactured, much of it just noise, assertions and mythologies around viral origins. And some of this spilled back and actually cut off funding for you in recent weeks that Jon and others had written about. So I guess I'll say first, Peter, how are you doing?
Great. Never been better. I mean, this is a critical moment for us all, and this is what our organization is set up to do. So this is a great time to be working on this issue. Absolutely.
And what is the latest on your funding for your operation? If you could give a thumbnail sketch of what EcoHealth has been doing, and specifically on the virus, that would be a great start.
Well, I mean, we've been working in China for ever since SARS, so about 16 years, something like that. And our goals were to find out, where did SARS come from? Is it still out there? Can we do anything about trying to stop a future SARS event? And what we did is find a huge diversity of SARS-related coronaviruses, including some that are really similar to SARS, that you could show in the lab, could infect human cells, could cause SARS-like disease in lab models, that resisted the vaccine and most of the therapeutics that were out there. So we thought there was a clear and present danger of these viruses emerging. And we talked about that openly. A lot of the reporting that was done through great outlets like the two reporters you got on the call today raised the red flag to say that these viruses were a high-risk group, among with many others,
Yeah.
So what actually happened was one of these viruses did emerge and eventually caused a really significant outbreak, a lot more significant than we thought a SARS-like event would be. We all thought SARS, a repeat of that, would be controllable. And unfortunately, this one is sufficiently different in its ability to spread and to cause disease that it escaped out of China and became a global pandemic. And then we've seen this incredible, as you call an infodemic, really just a politicization of what's happened, coupled with social media, coupled with this deep-seated desire from people to have to point a finger at someone or a country or a group of people and say, you're the fault, you're to blame, whether that's a country like China or a group of people like scientists or different politicians. And it's really messed up how we responded to it. And it's cost lives. I mean, yeah, we've lost one contract, one grant on the basis of that. But the real issue is it's delayed our outbreak response and killed people. And that's serious. When we first saw the conspiracies circulating on the web, it was kind of laughable. How could anyone think that this didn't come from bats, like we've been saying for 16 years? But it is very damaging and very insidious and difficult to deal with.
Yeah, and Angie can weigh in on some of those the properties of this particular virus that are still trying to be understood. This is, I think, one thing that contributes to the infodemic expanse isn't just the misinformation, but the actual just overload of information. We have these new non-peer-reviewed papers popping in, and I've written for more than 10 years about this whiplash effect you see in journalism, where if we're too tuned in to the new thing, we're competing with the next person, and the reader is just like completely buffeted in ways that are paralytic instead of actionable. So Angie, maybe a brief thought from you on both this question of understanding the origins of a virus in order to understand how it plays out, and what's the latest thinking on its intensity and the way it works?
Well, I mean, as far as its intensity and the way it works, that's still a very open question. We do know a little bit more than we did before about the role of the host response, which is specifically what I study. That this virus, like many other emerging pathogens, has the ability to get around the body's antiviral defenses. And really that results in a sort of out of control inflammatory state, which is what we think we are seeing in the most severe COVID patients. We still have a long way to go, though. Right now, there is still no animal model of severe disease, which makes it very difficult to try to dissect like some of the mechanisms that are underlying, what makes a person go from being a healthy person with no risk factors, for example, to being, needing a double lung transplant. We really don't know that much about what determines who is going to get really sick, other than the risk factors that are already really obvious, such as age or these other underlying comorbidities. In terms of the infodemic we were just kind of talking about, it's been really difficult. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that people in general who are not scientists are not used to interpreting hot off the press scientific findings. And so it's very difficult for the average person, even people who are well educated but may not have a scientific background, to distinguish between, what is a good piece of evidence and what is not. And actually the reporting around the origin of the virus, including by a number of political reporters talking about these diplomatic cables and so forth, none of that is evidence about the origin of a virus, that it comes from bats. As Peter was saying, there are mountains of evidence that these viruses have been circulating in China, these bat SARS-like coronaviruses. It's not very difficult for scientists to understand that a diplomatic cable that says some vague things is not scientific evidence, but it's much harder for the average person to distinguish between, a mountain of scientific papers in scientific journals and basically a political opinion piece in the Washington Post. We're also seeing a really unfortunate trend of some of the scientific data being released, both as I mean, the preprints I think are fine. In general, it's good to have the information out there. Scientists understand that they're not peer reviewed, and peer review itself is not, a foolproof process. But I think we're starting to see a lot of people release findings, including scientific data, as press releases, even as tweets. And that's a very difficult way it further complicates the situation for people to distinguish between what is good, reliable evidence and what might not be. I've been, as you mentioned, I've been very active on social media trying to just clarify that for people as best as I can, but it's very confusing even for me. So it's really a problem. And I think that we are now at the stage in this pandemic where people are sort of overloaded with information about stuff, and they kind of shut down. They don't really know what they want to believe. So oftentimes I think sometimes people believe the explanation that appeals to them the most.
Yeah, and just what you said, they actually do know what they want to believe. That's a confirmation bias, which is, as a journalist, and we're going to now talk to the journalists here, I was oblivious to things like confirmation bias and all the, most journalists I grew up with in the 20th century never thought about how information moves. We just did our stories and said, hey, that's a great story. We congratulated each other with awards and stuff. But then you get into this weird landscape now and you realize, oh, wow, so most of the time information doesn't matter. That creates this whole other need. And I'm hoping that journalists are catching up with that. And as you say, not just journalists, but practitioners can get involved if they start to understand that ecosystem. So Eliza Barclay at Vox, you're in an editing position. You're not like byline every day. You've done some really great work on this as an individual. What's your thinking? What would you want to ask Peter, among other things, and Angie? But then, where are you heading these days when you think about this issue of viral origins and solutions? And I'm just showing people while you talk. I'm going to show folks a little bit without the sound, a little bit of one of Vox's recent.
Oh, great. Yeah, we have many, many great videos.
I know.
Well, I guess, I just want to add a little bit to a comment on sort of my experience of the infodemic, which I think probably all four of us experienced in different ways. It was really fascinating, frankly, to see how passionate a lot of lay people, non-scientists, and how involved in this story of the virus origin so many people became, and indeed how much confirmation bias appeared to be at play in among a lot of people who just became just so sure that this rumor possibility, I guess, that the virus might have leaked from the Wuhan lab. That particular theory just took on such an incredible intensity for a couple of months. I'm curious, Angie and Peter's perception of how strong it still is, and Jon's as well. But it seems like it's died down a bit. Fortunately, the political leaders are not talking about it as much anymore. But in terms of, I wrote 2 stories about scientists' perspective on the virus origin, interviewing Angie and Peter in one of them, and it was just unbelievable the amount of email and Twitter attention those stories got, and so many people writing me, non-scientists writing me, telling me how sure they were that the virus leaked from the lab. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and I think Peter already spoke to them, and you did too, about how these beliefs and theories get loose. But I just found it sort of fascinating in terms of, I think, the sort of baseline, perhaps, suspicion of China. I think that was a part of a starting point for some people, and then this sort of exciting, almost spy novel-ish, possibility that it leaked from the lab, and just people got so into it.
Right. Well, there you go with that. We have these story frames in our heads. Oh, it must be bad guy, good guy thing, and then boom, there it is.
Right, and as Peter said, it's with very serious consequences, and I'm glad to see that that China is going to allow another team in from the WHO to do a deep investigation of the virus origin, and we may or may not ever get a clear answer on this, but at least it's going to be scientists doing that work.
Right.
So anyway, that I just wanted to sort of comment on that because it was a very intense part of, for me personally, and part of covering this was just the angry emails and tweets that I got of people telling me how wrong I was to question the theory that it leaked from the lab. You know, and I guess, you know, I will say that also to Angie's point, like this is a really challenging story, scientifically, politically, socially. It's been an amazing experience, and you know, we've learned so much, but it continues to be really challenging. And of course, you know, now in terms of where the transmission is going in the US, I mean, it's really, we're obviously on a very disturbing trend now. And, and, you know, it just is a reminder of how the focus was on the wrong things early on. Our leaders were focused on the wrong things. And, you know, we're seeing over and over how, you know, the failures early on to take it seriously and focus on the right things.
And Peter, well, actually, let's get to Jon Cohen too. Again, you've been through this for decades. AIDS had all kinds of conspiracy and should I say false hopes and questions, some of which endure today. You know, when you think now of where we're at with this one, and you think about the cycle of learning you've done covering these challenges generally, what comes to mind?
Eliza makes a good point about the changing narrative, and this origin questions dog every emerging disease. HIV has had this, the pandemic H1N1, there were all these stories about which pig farm did it come from. Ebola, was it a bat in a tree that this kid interacted with? We're fascinated by the question of origin, I think in part for the reason that Peter pointed out, which is that we want someone to blame. But we also, I think, have this human nature when accidents happen to say, couldn't this have been prevented? Couldn't we have done something? And if you can point to something, it makes it more satisfying in a sense. And I think theories also thrive in the absence of data. And what has been happening here is there's a dearth of data. And the narrative started off here. Remember that there was a seafood market. It had this outbreak, and by God, we shut down the market and everything went away. And then I did a story early on saying, you know what, there are 4 cases out of the 5 earliest cases that aren't linked to the seafood market. Huh? You know, so that narrative that was very tight and very controlled by the Chinese government to say, we've got this, it's under control, was wrong. That's not what happened. So that creates suspicion, and you mix that in with the proximity. You cannot get away from the fact that the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which studies bat coronaviruses, Peter, is in Wuhan. And so that's why people start pointing to the lab. It's not crazy. And it could have spilled over in the lab. And it could have happened in one of 2 ways. It could have been a gain of function experiment that was trying to make a virus more adaptable to humans, or it could have been just a simple accident. And there's an additional complexity that people who aren't scientists struggle with, and that's this notion of an intermediary species. You know, it didn't come most likely from bats to humans. And I think Peter and Angie would agree with this, that that's not the most likely scenario. Most likely scenario is what we saw happen with MERS and what we saw happen with SARS, which are very convincing that MERS came from camels, that first was in bats, somehow it got into camels, and that civet cats got infected somehow from bats somewhere along the chain. And this notion of like, the bats are the great-great-grandparents of the virus. They're not most likely the direct host. And the closest virus to this virus, oh my God, it happens to be again from the Wuhan Institute. But it's at least 20 years apart in evolutionary time. So it is not the virus that triggered this. All of that's very confusing, I think, for most people. And I think that we have to be honest about the possibility of spillover occurring from a lab. It has happened before. It has happened with SARS in China before. So it could have happened. And now it comes down to the question of what evidence do we have? And as it stands right now, the Chinese government has not been particularly open about allowing origin researchers from outside of China to work there, and hasn't published much at all about their own origin research. And what they have revealed often has been in press releases and often has been very confusing. For example, the samples that they found at the seafood market that tested positive. What did they test? How many animals were tested? What exactly was done? I don't know. And so all of that fuels the confusion and conspiracy theorists. And I would argue very strongly, give us data. Let the international scientific community do the studies. The HIV theories flourished until we had strong data from chimpanzees in Cameroon and in Tanzania that allowed us to see, and strong data from old human samples that allowed us to see the migration of this virus from chimpanzees into humans. And it makes a very solid argument. And the civet cat argument, it's 10 nucleotides different. That's nothing. This is 1,100 nucleotides different from the closest bat viruses. So keep all those things in mind when thinking through it, that it's complex and there aren't data.
The data, more data, transparency are critical
Give us
components.
Stop arguing theory. I mean, I can make up I've got some great theories, by the way, Andy, about how this started. I have no evidence for them. But you know what animal really, really loves fish? Cats. Cats get infected by SARS-CoV-2 really easily. We've seen that all over the world. Could cats have been the origin? Well, they might have been. I don't have any data to support that, but that's my theory. And then I could make a whole thing about that. But it's ridiculous. I have no evidence. Would I look at cats and veterinary samples of stored cat sera? Absolutely. I'd love to see that. But I don't have any evidence for that.
So that's a good, there's some good fodder there to throw back to Peter and to Angie. What are the, we have to think of this in two ways. One is, what do we do right now? You know, what's information that can be beneficial in the moment? And then what's beneficial to mitigate risk of disease? Let's call it disease Y, right, Peter? Because disease X, we thought there was a disease X lurking out there in 2018. And Peter, you know, this piece you wrote in February was so important, where you had said, this is it. That was February 24th or 27th. I had been at a meeting on Zika with journalists on how to cover emerging risks like Zika in 2018. I used the slide of the World Health Organization making research priority this general phenomenon of how do you get some clarity and forecastability around disease XYZ and whatever comes next. So given what Jon was just saying, what comes to mind for you, setting aside the funding stoppage, the NIH, the politics fights, where do we go if we want to have a rational system?
First of all, you know, Jon's right. We need data, but I think that the public are looking at this the wrong way. I think we're all looking at this the wrong way around. We're looking at this as an accident or as something happened here. So we trace back from that event back to how did that happen? And what the public expects is scientists to find the exact person that was infected. Like we saw this story around Ebola, the tree where the bats lived and that child played in that tree. We kind of all rolled our eyes at that story. It's a great story, but it doesn't reflect what's really happening in nature. And I put it to everybody that there are data out there on this, huge amount of data. For HIV, when HIV emerged, we didn't know that chimpanzees carried simian immunodeficiency viruses. We do know that bats carry an incredible diversity of SARS-related coronaviruses, very closely related to SARS-1 and now SARS-2. We just uploaded 780 sequences onto GenBank and published, it's going through review right now, of bat origin coronaviruses in China. And we'd published a bunch more before that. So there were data out there. We'd shown that people were infected by bat origin coronaviruses in South China at a level in some places of 3% of people had antibodies. If those antibodies have a half-life of a couple of years, and you look at the whole population in rural China, you're talking 1 to 7 million people a year infected by SARS-like viruses. Most of them are not going to cause illness. Many of them don't even transmit among the cells of the body, and very few would likely cause outbreaks. And what we may have seen with this one is the one that managed to get into a person that then spread, that then went into a market or a city like Wuhan and caused a pandemic. So tracing from nature rather than from humans back into nature or back into a lab is, I think, the right way to go. And I think this points to a really fundamental problem in the way we do. We work on diseases, infectious diseases, and we have been doing for 50 years. We're incredibly reductionist. We're relying more and more on molecules, vaccines against a portion of the stalk protein of HIV, or the insertion point in the spike protein that cleaves and allows it to. Guys, look to nature. Millions of people interacting with bats every day in Southeast Asia. Tens of millions of bats with 5 to 10% prevalence of these viruses, shedding thousands of viruses every day. That's where this starts. They trickle into our population and occasionally cause pandemics. The data are out there. We're looking in the wrong place. We're looking to lab virology to solve this problem. It's an ecological, socioeconomic problem, much harder to understand, much more complex. It involves social science. It involves wildlife biology. It involves, yes, sequence analysis and lab virology, but the social science and the changes going on in the environment over decades are driving pandemics, and that's the problem we've got to deal with. And I think we missed the point completely.
It's such a valuable perspective, and this same thing applies to thinking about mitigating the risk now, because it's so social and behavioral sciences that inform all these questions about what people do, the variegated responses to information. On July 10th, we're doing a session with Heidi Larson and with Renee DiResta, who are dug in on this vaccine confidence question. And it's all about information, culture, perception. You can have a great vaccine, and Jon has written about this before, and not if you don't have enough uptake, of course, then you don't have the immunity and effect. So those social sciences are a huge part of how we should be thinking about things, but it seems like it's still hard to get that holistic approach. Angie, you're at this interface. You're at the School of Public Health, which is all about behavior change, and it's about science, it's about medicine, but it's about public behavior related to health risk too. So you're not just a virologist, right? Can you talk about that? What Peter just said in that context?
Well, I completely agree with Peter that we are looking at this in ways that are too really siloed. They're siloed from each other. So, I mean, I am really a lab virologist, and I of course think that doing that type of virology, understanding mechanisms of pathogenesis and susceptibility and so forth are really important. But I completely agree that you can't ignore the larger socioeconomic issues that Peter was talking about. And a lot of times we talk about doing interdisciplinary research. That means getting together like a computational biologist and a statistician and a virologist and maybe an epidemiologist. But you're not talking to anthropologists. You're not talking to economists. You're not talking to people who will address the aspect that Peter was just talking about, which is preventing the spillover from occurring in the first place. So while it is important to understand how these viruses adapt to humans, how they are transmitted between humans, if you really want to get ahead of this, you need to address the factors that are causing people to be exposed to these viruses in the first place. Because the solution is not to eradicate wildlife. Obviously, it's not to prevent people from moving around. I mean, people are going to be mobile and traveling. We're going to continue developing land. We need to figure out ways to do this that will reduce and minimize people's exposure risk. And some of that is the type of work that Peter does, going out and finding out where these viruses are, what kind of animals they're in, the types of exposure that people might have to them. Some of it's the type of work that I do, coming up with basically countermeasures or better understanding of what allows a virus to cause disease in a human host or in a wildlife host for that matter. And some of it is going to be making it economically and socially feasible for people to minimize their risk of being exposed in the first place as much as possible. And I think that we haven't really, there's not enough crosstalk between disciplines to allow this to happen right now. And there's also not enough funding to do this. So there's really two big problems. We're not getting all the right people at the table. We're also not paying enough people to be at the table. And both of those things need to happen. And I would say that the final piece is that, and one thing that really, really concerns me is the emphasis on, nationalism and a lack of international cooperation. As Jon pointed out, that type of data transparency, data sharing with the international community is really critical to understanding the origins of this virus, much less another one. We are not going to be able to stop the next pandemic if everybody's looking out for themselves and people are not working and collaborating with each other. And I agree with Eliza that it's a good sign that, the WHO is now sending a team in to investigate the origins of this virus. But we need to be more proactive about this. We need to have the type of collaboration such as Peter had with his colleagues at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We need to have more of those types of collaborations between people all around the world if we're really going to get ahead of the next so-called big one.
And by the way, theoretically, the mechanism by which we're all communicating right now, from the far corners of this country at least, should be greatly amplifying the capacity to do some of those things. We just did a session here a week ago with folks at the Atlantic Council asking the question, can we build an immune system for the planet? Essentially, it's a digital immune system. In other words, where you have an early warning capacity that's really integrated actionably with some sense of common data analysis so that some signals from China or wherever are interpreted in ways that can meaningfully change policy everywhere. And boy, it's a grand challenge with capital G, capital C. And it's mostly because of trade and politics, and the capacities are all there. They're all there. I want to ask the journalists, a question came in from Betsy Rosenberg. Why isn't mainstream media talking about the ecological drivers? And I think a good way to interpret that question a little more richly is, are we bad still at reporting on or engaging readers with these multidimensional aspects of problems? Or are we stuck in our own little silos? Maybe we'll start with Eliza at Vox.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I would say that we at Vox have done some stories on the ecological drivers. Not enough. We could definitely do more. And I feel like I've seen some stories as well, some very good stories in the mainstream media, but it's true that the focus of the media has largely been on the response, the virus itself, the illness, and really there has been little attention on the ecological drivers. And I actually just wanted to ask Peter a question. Given what you said about this tendency to focus on these sort of very small points in what is this very massive, complex process of disease emergence, I wonder if you think at this stage, if it's still worth it to look for patient zero in China, or if it's a waste of resources at this point, given, as you've discussed so much, the high probability of another event and the need to devote resources to finding that next, maybe even more deadly, more transmissible SARS virus.
Oh yeah, I think it's absolutely worth it still. I mean, patient zero is one thing, but certainly animal zero, the chain of transmission from whatever the real bat reservoir is, of the grandfather, as Jon said, or the great grandfather, and then whatever intermediate species might be involved, and what community started this off, whether it's a wildlife trade community, whether it's an urban group, or somewhere in rural China. And the reason we need to do that work is because we can then better understand what drives pandemics, what are the factors that led to that event, and learn about blocking that, basically stopping spillover, blocking early spread before it gets into a city, before it becomes uncontainable. I mean, we did that with Nipah virus in Malaysia. It took us 5 years to distinguish between various hypotheses of how this virus emerged. Was it carried by a bat from somewhere else? Was it related to climate change or to agricultural intensification? We eventually showed it was related to livestock patterns. It takes time, and that's the problem. And nobody's got the patience for that right now. We're in a pandemic, we're suffering, we've lost our own control over our lives, and we want answers. We want to know who did this. It's those people that eat bats. It's China. It's it's reckless behavior, X, Y, and Z. Well, no, it's not. It's things that we all do all around the world. We eat wildlife in just about every country. We eat wildlife here in the US. Deer, squirrel, possum. People eat those animals. We eat fish. We eat lobster. And there are risks associated with that. But there's this impatience at waiting. And I do think it's great that WHO is sending a team in, but it's absolutely unrealistic to expect that they're going to get any closer to understanding the origins. It's really important that there's a dialogue with China, because that's being blocked by all this political interference. And that undermines our own national security here in the US and our own public health.
I think we have, at Science, we have covered ecological aspects pretty thoroughly. And I love doing those stories. And so do the people I work with. And they've written about Peter. My colleagues have written about you and your team for years. And frankly, it's great to go into the field with people who are doing that kind of work. It's colorful, it's fascinating. They're really attractive stories, and they're important stories. But I do think that we have to look at other successful attempts to understand origin. And I wholeheartedly agree that they take a long time. And the point you made about chimpanzees and HIV, Peter, I would challenge that. We didn't know initially that chimps were a reservoir, but it became clear pretty early. And the conspiracy theories and all these wacky theories thrived for years until data amassed that made a convincing case. And it probably took from the first human being detected with HIV in 1981, I would argue until about, I remember doing an article called The Hunt for the Origin of HIV in 2000 that I wrote for the Atlantic Monthly. So it lasted for a very long time. And we just got recently in 2016 strong evidence of where the pandemic H1N1 flu virus came from, a pig farm in Mexico or a collection of pig farms. And we really didn't know that for, 7 years. And I think we can learn a lot from successes of the past. And I do think it's going to take years to ferret this out. I also think we have to be honest about all possibilities and not be reactionary. And I'm not accusing you of this, Peter, but I think some people are very dismissive right away of the notion that the lab could have been a source. It could have, and it could have been that a lab worker who trapped bats and released them got infected. It could be. There's no evidence for that, but it could be. And I think it's incumbent upon scientists to be open-minded. The problem is that people take advantage of the generosity of open-minded thinking. And that's what happens to scientists again and again, because the whole framework of scientists is based on this notion of I don't believe, I know what I know based on the data I have today, and I'll change my mind. I'm not a politician. I'm not going to be punished if I change my mind. I'm going to be rewarded by my colleagues if I hold one theory and then later have another one because of new data. And people take advantage of that generosity of thought. That's what happens. And I would like to know from the WHO team going into China, one, why aren't journalists allowed to join them? How come I can't go? I would love to be there. Let's be transparent. Two, what are the studies that need to be done? Not what are you going to accomplish in your 1 week there, but what are the critical studies? And I can list the studies I'd like to see done. Certainly, I'm sure that Angie and Peter have their own pet ideas of what to look at. This might not have started in Wuhan. Stop it. We know that the pandemic H1N1 virus was first detected in San Diego, where I live, in 2009. And we now know that it was a pig farm or a collection of pig farms in Mexico that likely are the origin. Maybe this didn't begin in Wuhan. I don't know. I'm completely open-minded about it. And I think that's the generosity of thought that we have to embrace. We don't know. And let's ask the right questions.
So that's some stuff to chew on there. What do you all think?
I was just going to echo Jon, sorry, real quick, just echo him that, yeah, it is very frustrating, especially now that the press is a lot better up to speed on what type of investigative, epidemiological investigations could happen, that we really don't know what China has been up to on that front. And they haven't told us what type of research they've been doing at all. And just that absence is frustrating in trying to gauge how seriously they're taking that very investigation. That's all.
So Peter and Angie, I think you had something, right?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment quickly on one thing that I've observed about not only the question of origin, but all kinds of things like, do these drugs work or not? How effective are masks? Things like that. Is that the public really wants to have this conversation where these things are really binary categories. They want to believe that the virus either came from a lab or maybe it came from nature. There's not any kind of spectrum, when in reality, most of these questions are continuous variables. So, there's more than one natural origin story. It doesn't necessarily mean that there was a bat involved directly. There may have been an intermediate species, as Jon said. There may be more than one intermediate species, but these things are often not really considered. It's not this generosity of thought that Jon was just talking about is really a spectrum of different possibilities that we need to be open to. And it seems like it's very, very difficult for people to, I think that people are really uncomfortable with uncertainty, and having a spectrum of possibilities means a lot of uncertainty. And it means, we're going to have to gather a lot of data, a lot of evidence to try to make sense of those things. And we may never have a complete black and white, crystal clear explanation for it. And I think that that's really a problem that has really dominated a lot of the conversations around this pandemic in general. People don't want to understand, for example, that you can put on a mask, but it's not going to provide complete protection. So you also need to have social distancing and other risk reduction measures put into place. And cumulatively, these can provide a greater level of protection for people, even if it's not complete. People want to hear either masks work or they don't. And that has unfortunately really been very polarizing for people. And I think it's really degraded the conversations we're having as a society about these really important public health issues.
Yeah, Peter, there's lots for you to chew on, but I wanted to bring it to amplify that point. David Wallace Wells in New York Magazine, who covered climate, wrote a big book about climate recently, but he's been diving in on this. He did a piece on trust and the lack of trust. It was a very objective look at just what Angie was saying, that we have to get more comfortable early on with science and its messengers saying what we don't know with equal vigor with the things we do know. I do think there's a fear factor there that George Pataki and Giuliani, when the dust was settling over Manhattan after 9/11, I was reporting on that. And it's so hard for a politician to say we don't know. And it's hard for many scientists, because then they fear that, just as Angie was saying, that society will say, oh, well, we don't know, therefore don't do anything. And so, but Peter, there's a lot for you to chew on there. So I hope you were taking notes on some of the things.
I love this stuff. This is why having a conversation like this is, because you learn from it. And I mean, Jon, you're right. The HIV conspiracy theories or questions about origins are still there. I mean, I remember doing this. I Googled at one point when I thought, is that HIV story still out there that it was made in a lab? And sure enough, second page in on Google, you find it. And people who still believe that, including a Nobel Prize winner who went out and spoke about that openly. I mean, it is incredible. These things really do linger, despite the evidence. And I think the fundamental issue is, we look at this, you can look at the O.J. Simpson case, right? Did he murder or not a person, right? So he goes up for criminal trial. The level of evidence we require is beyond a reasonable doubt, and he's found innocent. Then there's a civil trial, and then it's a different level of evidence. It's the preponderance of evidence. And I think that's the problem. In science, I think we're dealing with the preponderance of evidence, especially on an issue where you can't create an experiment. You can't do it all over again and change the controls and see what happens. You've got an event that's already happened with evidence that's disappearing. So what is that evidence? And the preponderance of evidence is that it probably did come from the wild and probably not from a lab. It almost certainly wasn't bioengineered. There's no evidence of that. There's actually no evidence that it came out of the lab, that it was in the lab in the first place. But the preponderance of evidence, I think, really clearly shows that it came from nature. The problem is, as Angie said, the public are relying on a black and white, yes or no. You're guilty, handcuffs on, and off you go to jail. And it doesn't work like that. And neither should it. And, you know, I don't know what the answer to all of this is, but yeah, more evidence will come out, as Jon said. And, you know, the journalists are so sophisticated, including both Eliza and Jon, but many others, at getting these messages out there. And I do agree that many journalists over recent history have talked about this economic driver. And they're great stories. The environmental drivers of pandemics, they are great stories. I think one of the reasons why they don't have as much traction in the public mind is there's nothing better than having a vaccine here in my hand that will stop me getting this disease, versus, well, don't worry, all we've got to do is reduce the impact of the wildlife trade across a whole region of Southeast Asia, reduce deforestation in certain high biodiversity regions. It's harder to understand, it's less tangible, and it's less black and white. And I think that's why, you know, we rely on drugs and vaccines way too much for new diseases, because here we are waiting for them. And we're not doing enough to remove the risk in the first place.
You've reminded me so much of Kirk Smith, who just passed away, sadly, too young, one of the great pioneers in public health, environmental pollution impacts on health. I was in India with him looking at biomass pollution, cooking, and he said, you know, doctors are the failure people. He's not saying that to criticize doctors, but you go to the doctor when you're sick. And public health, he's a public health scientist, and is all about making a system resilient and robust so that you're promoting the opposite of illness. And that, I think, as Peter just said, there's a downside to that, having that landscape approach. But the upside is it's a pretty easy sell to say, to look at the basics. What are the basic parameters we know, even as we pursue these really important granular questions? And we know that deforestation and edges of human and environmental exposure are risk zones. So that's something you really know. You can actually build policies around that. So I think that even though it sounds vague and weird, if we can have more capacities to do some of those basic things, hand washing, you know, the basics, getting across the basic understanding that distance is your friend in a viral world, in a viral moment.
Can I address?
Yeah, Jon.
I think there are things we can do to better articulate the public conversation here and clarify things. I think we have to be honest about the bad behavior of governments. And I think both the Chinese and the US government have behaved badly here and confused the messages. And I'm not being partisan when I say this, and I'm criticizing both equally. They have made many mistakes in terms of this question of origin, both countries. And we have to be honest, and we have to say those things out loud. And I think we also have to look critically at the scientific community when they do things, when that community does things that doesn't help clarify discussions and arguments. And there have been papers published that are absolutely ridiculous about origin theories. And I could name them and name names, and I'm sure Angie and Peter and maybe Eliza have read them. And you read them and you hold your head and think, are you kidding me? And then the pangolin story being an intermediate here, that gets all blown out of proportion. I don't think there's strong evidence that pangolins are the intermediary theory species here. They're certainly getting infected by bat coronaviruses, absolutely. There's some similarities, but let's be blunt and honest about things that are whack and stop being effete about it all. You know, when we have the government of the United States at the top level telling the National Institutes of Health to cut off a grant, and over 70 Nobel laureates saying, why are you doing this? And then what's the response from the White House? There is no response. There's silence. And when we have the Chinese government telling its researchers you have to go through extra layers of review to publish papers about origin studies. And by the way, if you're a scientist in China, you may not speak with the media unless you have intense control from the government about everything you say. All of that confuses the conversation. All of that, in my mind, is bad. What we want is transparency and open discussion about this, and the ability to entertain all ideas and look at them critically. Then you will calm down the high fevers, the feverish pitch that takes off with people who are saying things that are outlandish, because you're being honest.
So what can Vox and Science Magazine and the New York Times and CBS do? You know, there was that really powerful CBS 60 Minutes piece on Peter. There's been a lot of coverage of, but as we all know right here, there's a hyper focus on the politics. And as Jon said, in this case, there are some aspects of the politics that are the problem. But that hyper focus then seems to sort of take us into a blockage on what you do. And that feels like one of the puzzle pieces there, but I don't know about what we in the media can do. We've had many sessions on here about what the media can do, but I don't know if Vox talks about this. And at Science Magazine, you know, you're in a special position as a hugely influential publication among science and scientific organizations, but you're cut off from the bigger world. What can we do together? Is there anything we can do together?
Not see it that way at all, Andy.
Oh, good.
We're open to the public. We write for anyone to read us. We're not written for scientists, and we're part of the conversation on the same scale as the New York Times or Vox or anyone else. We bristle at the notion that we're not.
Your pieces are great. I'll take that back.
Take it back.
But still, then what do we do? So maybe does Vox talk about this? Does Ezra talk about this at a high level? You know, he's so political.
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, we have to do exactly what Jon said, which is highlight, first of all, the lack of transparency and the information that we do need. We have to do our jobs well, right? Which is talking to a lot of people, doing really good reporting. And honestly, that is something that we as an organization have just kind of reprioritized, is the importance of reporting. Because as you know, in the current sort of media hustle, right, there are a lot of incentives to just move really fast and not talk to as many people as you could. And we've been talking about this internally, both connected to pandemic coverage and to racial injustice coverage. So I think that's a sort of reminder that every reporter and editor needs on a regular basis of do the work, do our work, and seek out, diverse voices and, the people who maybe you don't agree with off the bat. So I think, it's obviously very basic, but really important. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else, I mean, we just, obviously we need to, the people who run our companies also need to just continue to innovate to figure out how we can expand our staff. And there have been so many layoffs, and science coverage, as we know, is down in at a lot of outlets, if not already gone. So I just also think there's a huge sort of impetus on foundations and people in the digital media industry to figure out how to sustain this work and expand it.
There's a comment and a question that came in from LinkedIn user. I'm not sure who that is over on LinkedIn, but it's about initially about film and video, and here, more tools in the communication journalism toolbox. The one tool that I think is underapplied, it's hard to think of how to scale it, is engagement. And I don't mean engagement journalism, meaning, hey, who out there has had a problem in pregnancy? Or we want your worst cases of survival on a ventilator. That's one kind of engagement. But I mean holding convenings in which the public are asking questions and policymakers are put to account, and like a town hall on CNN, but where there's continuity. So it's not like a one-time event where you have sort of a driving force. We are here to explore what we don't know as well as what we do know, to engage with people who bristle at masks, but who care about public health. to get past the symbology and the flame throwing. I think there's a there. There are some examples. They're still tiny, like in Ohio. The Akron Beacon Journal started out 100 whatever years ago as a newspaper. Now they have Your Voice Ohio. And it was the opioid crisis that drove them to do this. Community in crisis, complex, no simple solution. And they began a convening model. This is pre-COVID, so they actually had meetings. That has generated more trust for them as a media and created more of a sense of trajectory. And it feels like something that has to be part of the toolbox, as this LinkedIn contributor says. It's a little different than what we do. I think what I'm trying to do here is a little bit like this, but we're still mostly hyper-specialized, right? So having this spill over into broader communities feels like something that's important to try to do. Peter and Angie, you have the floor for, maybe Angie first, for some final takeaway thought. I'd like to end this program with something we can actually do differently tomorrow. Like, what can I do with EcoHealth Alliance, or what can we at Public Health and at the Earth Institute do to facilitate better journalism? And or what do you want to work on differently tomorrow than yesterday? So Angie, what comes to mind? What's the landscape of opportunity here?
I mean, for me, I really wish that, and this is not necessarily something I can do because I've already been trying to do this, but I would really like to hear from a lot more people in the scientific community. And if there's any way that scientists could even get some kind of media training or communications training to communicate with the public more effectively. One problem that I've really run into is, it's very difficult to communicate about complex scientific topics without sounding like you're condescending or dumbing it down to the point that nobody really wants to listen to you. It's very difficult, though, because all of our scientific fields are full of jargon. They're not very accessible to the regular person. And I could certainly benefit from improving the way that I talk to people in the public about really complex scientific topics. Because the way that it goes now, with especially the people who are the most resistant to hearing about, to having their confirmation bias challenged, those conversations devolve very rapidly. And I find myself arguing about why viruses are not exosomes that have been induced by 5G wireless signals. And it's really a problem because I don't honestly know how to get through to those people. There are some people who may never be reachable. For example, there's a lot of people who really gripped on to the Chinese lab origin theory on the basis of racism. And the federal government certainly hasn't helped by, politicians, including the president, throwing out these racist dog whistles all the time. But so there may be some people who are just not reachable, but I think that there are a lot of other people who are, and there are many of these people that sort of double down on this confirmation bias. I'd like to learn more effective ways to talk to those people so we can shift this from a conversation of blame to a conversation that really captures the complexity of the topic and also includes a lot of the stakeholders from the community and not just the scientific community. My firm belief and one of my core philosophies is really that we can't have public health without the engagement of the public. And we really need to have more of these people with a seat at the table, but myself included, we all need to learn better how to talk to those people and how to have this type of discussion. And I realize that's nothing concrete that I can do tomorrow, but this is something that I think about it a lot. And I'd welcome any suggestions or ideas that anybody has for not only how I could get better, but how I could, help my colleagues improve in this area.
Well, I will say that on Monday and every Monday, we do now these Thriving Online sessions on this webcast, which are all about how to build better interfaces between expertise and data and the public in ways that can have some outcome. Peter, a last thought from you. Thank you again for your time. I know it's precious.
My pleasure. No, look, I really hope that this moment in time shifts our discussion around pandemic emergency, the emerging diseases in general, and we start to accept that there is this complex process going on that drives them. But it's a process, if we do the right type of science and bring the right disciplines together, we can analyze it, understand it, predict it, and prevent it. And, we've been saying that for months. We get criticized every time we say we can predict and prevent pandemics. yeah, we're not going to prevent everyone. We're not going to predict everyone, but we know where they're generally coming from, what species carry viruses that generally get into people, and why. And if you know all that, you can start to reduce it. The real reason we failed, I think, is that we didn't scale that up to the level it's needed. We didn't ingrain that in the systems to prevent pandemics that are funded, that we all believe in and appreciate. I mean, we saw this new potentially pandemic swine flu in China. There's a system globally for monitoring pig herds for influenza viruses. That's a success. We can look at that in the lab, that virus, and see whether it infects human cells, whether any of the workers got infected. It's a success story. We now have to prevent that. We have to scale that sort of strategy up across the emerging disease hotspots.
So
all the above viruses.
That's wonderful. You know, one thing I just want to zoom in on that you said, it feels like, in a way, you were saying something very positive, that we're actually not that far from having the capacity, that it's not a heavy lift.
No.
To boost this.
Funny. But, you know, look, we've got proof of concept for every step of predicting what viruses there are out there and finding them, predicting from, in some cases, from sequence, how likely it is to get into people, tinkering in the lab to find out if it does, much criticized, working on the economics of the underlying drivers like deforestation, the wildlife trade. Companies want to do that now. They want to do less dangerous deforestation. The public want to consume products that aren't trashing the environment and driving pandemics. We need to address all of that. And that's what we've been trying to do. We've got proof of concept for each part of that. We now need to scale that up. We can all get involved in that by the way we buy and consume products, by the way we interact with wildlife around the planet. And we can certainly put pressure on our governments to do the right thing moving forward. We're going to need everyone to get involved. And someone made a comment about TV documentaries and movies. You know, let's have The Wire for pandemics. All of the messiness and the complexity laid out so you understand it's not just a straightforward issue. And this is where our journalists come in, who are doing a great job. And I look forward to working with you guys on the field in China, in Wuhan, with the feral cats very soon, Jon and Eliza and everybody else. You know, let's go there, get it done.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Peter Daszak of EcoHealth Alliance. Thanks to Eliza Barclay from Vox.com, Jon Cohen from Science Magazine, and Angela Rasmussen from the School of Public Health, Mailman School of Public Health here at Columbia. I'm Andy Revkin. This is Sustain What? It's a global online conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration and now the great pause that's been enforced on us by this virus. A prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment. It's the one Earth system changing faster than the actual environment. This webcast is produced as part of my work building Columbia University's new Earth Institute initiative on communication and sustainability. As soon as we're done, share the link you've been watching on with friends and circles far and wide. And get in touch with me with ideas. Just look down at the scrolling banner and you have my contact information. Thanks again to all those who've been watching today. And this, when it's done, it's there for everyone to share. So thank you again to my guests. More to do. And The Wire for pandemics. Peter, if you're not already working on that, I know some people who would love to talk to you about that. Thank you all.
Cheers.